I think so. Hello, good evening. We've been waiting a little bit for the air conditioning to kick in, and since there is none, I think we get started. My name is John Lehman, and I am a member of the board of directors of the Block Island Maritime Institute. We welcome you. And I'm going to tell you, we have a brand new or somewhat brand new mission statement. And it says, BIMI's mission is to provide educational experiences and hands-on exploration to inspire appreciation and preservation of the extraordinary saltwater environment around Block Island. We try our best to do this. We also try to make it free. So we do accept donations, just in case anybody is interested. I welcome you tonight to a terrific night of very, very unusual for us. We have a gorgeous author and a very well-known gentleman whose name is Joe Houlihan. Most of you may recognize him as the famous ferry scribbler of the Block Island Times. Years ago, and we're talking about the book, which is great. And I'm going to let them introduce the book, but I'm sure that many of you through the years went to Montauk. When in the 70s, I fished out of Montauk, sport fished with a bunch of friends. It was a quiet, kind of quiet fishing village. I have not been there in the last 3 years, but I understand it is becoming East Hampton. It has been discovered by the Hampton people that needed to expand to get out of the Hamptons, so they created another one. Anyway, it was one of the greatest, quietest little fishing villages, and that is the time that this story comes from. So without any more palaver, I give you these gorgeous people. Thank you, John.
Yes. Should I start by reading?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. I'm going to read to you. This is an essay that I recently published, which is sort of a postscript to the book that I wrote. And it doesn't have too many spoiler alerts if you haven't yet had the chance to read my book. And can you hear me all right in the back? Is the volume is good? Okay, great. Exactly 5 years ago, I began gathering material for what started out as an assignment for East magazine, but eventually morphed into my first nonfiction book. The story centered around a tragedy that occurred off the coast of Montauk in late March of 1984. 4 young fishermen, Michael Stedman, David Connick, Michael Vigilant, and Scott Clark, had been longlining for tilefish when their commercial fishing vessel, the Windblown, collided with an unpredicted early spring nor'easter. Somewhere between Block Island and Montauk Point, gale force winds and 40-foot seas swallowed the crew whole. Neither the steel-hulled boat nor the bodies of the men were ever recovered. As I began the years-long research and reporting process, my naive assumption was that by the end of it, I would surely come to know the 4 men who were lost at sea in equal measure. Sadly, nothing wound up being farther from the truth. The men started out as blank silhouettes. Like sketch marks, every interview filled in tiny details until, at last, human forms started taking shape. But the version of who the men had been, their histories, their dreams, their heartaches, largely depended upon who was still alive and wanted to speak with me. Try as I might, the youngest of the foursome, Scott Clark, known as Scotty, remained an enigma. He was the outsider, the new kid in town. Shortly after the Windblown went down, Scotty was the crew member whose last name all of the newspapers got wrong, Clark with an E, and he was only 18, not 19, which every news outlet from the New York Times to the East Hampton Star erroneously reported. While Captain Michael Stedman and Dave Connick had long-standing ties to East Hampton, and Michael Vigilant, the son of a legendary commercial fisherman who'd grown up in Montauk, Scotty was a relatively recent arrival, intent on developing a reputation around the docks as a reliable mate who wasn't afraid of a little hard work. Long and lean, when he wasn't offshore fishing, Scotty surfed and spent time with Julie Campbell, his girlfriend of about a year. Julie was exactly 1 year older and a pioneering fisherwoman who crewed aboard the Marlin IV. Scotty and Julie were caught in the same 1984 storm, each longlining for tilefish, separated way out in the canyons by some 5 miles of ocean. The Marlin IV made it back to the docks in the early morning hours of March 29th, but Scotty was still out. Scotty and Julie shared an immediate bond. Both were from away. Julie grew up in Point Lookout, but when her parents died, her older brother, Bill Campbell, brought her out to Montauk, where he had started putting down roots. Brother and sister eventually lived together in an apartment complex off Westlake Drive. Bill lived upstairs and Julie lived downstairs. The South Fork has since become home for both siblings. Bill is a charter captain based in Montauk, and Julie is a high-end landscaper who lives in Sag Harbor. Scotty was so new, and he was so different. The other 3 guys had connections in town, Bill said. I empathized with him because when I got here, I didn't know anybody either. Scotty's decision to longline for tilefish wasn't lost on Bill. It's very easy to wimp out on a tilefish boat, but he didn't wimp out, and it got him a lot of respect. Despite the miserable conditions, especially in the dead of winter, it's a tough habit to break. When you get that in your blood, he told me, you never find anything better. Nothing else makes your heart go pitter-patter. This past winter, I received a Facebook message from Denise Myers, one of Scotty's first cousins. At long last, a sign of life. She had recently finished my book and was eager to share with me a bit more about Scotty's backstory. Her mother, Xandra, and Scotty's mother, Donna, were sisters. Denise and Scotty, who were born 6 months apart, were raised less like cousins and more like siblings. Prior to receiving her message, I had been filled with regret. No matter how hard I had dug, the dozens of unreturned emails I had sent, the dozens of unanswered voice messages I had left, I always knew in the pit of my stomach that I was never able to get the full picture of who Scotty had been. It pretty much goes with the territory when it comes to writing nonfiction, especially about people who are no longer alive. How much about a person can you ever really get right? Denise soon added another layer of depth to who Scotty had been. Donna was a single mother who worked as an airline stewardess, and when she was away on business, her extended family helped raise and care for Scotty. As toddlers growing up on the outskirts of Clarksburg, West Virginia, one of Denise and Scotty's favorite games was to see how far they could unravel a spool of toilet paper before it broke in 2. Come summertime, when they weren't learning how to swim, they disappeared together in the nearby woods, the ground blanketed in moss and rhododendrons, contentedly making caves until the sky grew dark. But a marked shift occurred in young Scotty right around the time that his mother got together with Tom Llewellyn. The family remembered Tom as cold and distant, and Scotty refused to live with him under the same roof. After they married, the family of 3 moved to Oceanside on Long Island. Denise and Scotty tried staying in touch, but it was difficult. Back then, long-distance phone calls were inordinately expensive. Around the age of 10, Scotty started running away from his stepmother, most especially. He soon found a kinship at the docks where he baited hooks for the commercial day boats to earn extra money. By 14, he had dropped out of school and was gone for good. Donna was always a little off. Once her son was lost at sea, the lack of closure pushed her over the edge. Donna lived in the abyss, the black hole of losing a child. She never made it back up to the clear light of day. She believed that after the windblown went down, a Russian freighter picked up her son. No amount of reasoning could persuade her otherwise. Donna, who worked for Trans World Airlines, put any extra airline miles she accumulated to use. She traveled the globe, placing missing posters in various exotic destinations. Her life depended on believing that her son, if only by the sheer force of a mother's will, would someday be found. People kept telling Donna some version of, "You're crazy, he's dead, let it go." She paid them little mind. One time, the voices in her head told her that Scotty had purchased a home for her in the Midwest. Donna got in her car, drove west, and promptly made herself at home. The people who actually owned the house were away on vacation, and when they came home, they realized that the woman living in their house wasn't dangerous. To their astonishment, the house was actually far cleaner than when they had left. But they also realized that she wasn't all there. Other times, Donna had a habit of waving at planes flying overhead in the sky. When people asked her what she was doing, she explained that she was waving at Scotty. Her son was off saving the world. Donna's fragile mental state soon divided her extended family into two warring factions. One side of the family wanted to simply leave her be, albeit with a bit more supervision, and the other side advocated that she be forcibly medicated and hospitalized. When I was finishing my book, I concluded that Donna had died of a broken heart. And I wasn't altogether wrong, but in talking with Denise, I learned that Donna had a sickness in her head no amount of medicine could remedy. She was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia and spent the rest of her life in and out of psychiatric hospitals. In late July of 2010, Xandra paid her sister a visit to the Fairmont Medical Center in West Virginia, where she had been living in the psychiatric unit there for the past year. "He's really gone, isn't he?" Donna asked her. It had been some 26 years since she last saw her boy. "He was a good boy," Xandra answered back. "He wouldn't have caused you this pain if he could have stopped it." Xandra watched as a sense of peacefulness, some combination of grace and relief, settled across her sister's anguished face. Donna was a devout Pentecostal. Death wasn't something to fear, death was something to rejoice. A few days later, she went to meet her son. Now, in her 80s, Xandra ensures that flowers fill the two granite vases on either side of Scotty and Donna's joint headstone. Donna always loved pretty, brightly colored flowers, so every season, her sister swaps out artificial bouquets. In May, to celebrate the arrival of spring, she chose yellow dahlias. Thank you.
That does very strong piece of writing. First of all, happy to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces. You all know who you are. People I see in Point Judith all the time. And it is a pleasure to be out here, to be part of this, to be with Amanda, with my wife Cindy, with you all. What Amanda just wrote, will hover over this conversation this evening, because that was the end game of the Windblown. It's a fait accompli what happened to the boat. And it's a strong piece that we just heard. It brought chills to me. When I wrote it, I got chills again. Okay. Susan Bush. Okay. Hello, Susan. Susan is the reason I'm sitting here next to this woman here. She's the reason
Love
that
Susan.
I do too. Susan Bush is the reason that I, Joey Houlihan, who never leaves Galilee, never takes off on an airplane with his crazy wife to fly to different hemispheres, actually get on a boat and took the 13-mile trip to Block Island. I hardly ever come out here. I don't know where to go with that. I write for the paper out here, or I write stories, but I don't come here. Go figure. Susan Bush, a couple of years ago, Susan flips me books in the middle of the winter while I'm staring vacuously to the north, waiting for maybe the boat to cancel or people to come to Block Island. Susan comes rolling into the parking lot and says, "Hey, Houlihan, I think I got a good one for you." And she'll flip me a book. Never gives me a clunker. Well, on this particular day, she gave me a galley for the Lost Boys of Montauk. I took the book, and Susan knows that I literally work 150 feet from draggers in Galilee. I've been around the port of Galilee probably 90% of my life. So she figured maybe I would like the book. I burned through 40 pages at work during my shift, got off duty, went to the Point Judith Lighthouse where I took Amanda today. And then I continued to read another 125 pages of the book. And then the next day after work, I went to the lighthouse and completed the book. Then I started tracking her down because I had questions. Amanda and I, when she came into town today, I've never met her. We've emailed, we're Facebook friends, we've had some phone calls, we talk, we're writers. We fill up blank pages. You know, we're that person that sits in front of the blank page that dares us to make sense out of something. So that's what we do, we're writers. And first thing I did was we grabbed the car, put my car on the standby lot, got in her car before Cindy came to join us. And I took her over to the Point Judith Lighthouse at the little Camp Cronin Park where I read the book next to the monument of all of the lost fishermen from the Port of Galilee, 50% of whom I know, former students. One who was fetched up in a net drum on the Suzanne Beth at the age of 24, killed. Countless others. It's the most dangerous occupation in the country, I believe, being a fisherman. This book hit me very hard. It was very visceral reading this. And as a testament to this, and as an homage to my friend's work, I took her there to see this. Then we went to the top of the promontory and we looked at the Point Judith Lighthouse where my wife and I got hitched. I've been living in Galilee most of my life. My first punitive writing assignment was about the Point Judith Lighthouse when I was flunking out of school in 1964 while I was chasing her. I was flunking all my subjects. I ended up having a punitive assignment about the Point Judith Lighthouse. I've been writing ever since. So I took Amanda there to see that piece of land, that peninsula, and then look south to the island, then south to Montauk. This book, for anyone reading it on the island, conjuring the Southland or looking south, this book will have a very visceral feel to it. Atlantis Canyon's 120 miles from Montauk, and these guys went out there on the wind blown. Amanda, let me ask you, remember I called you that first phone call, the first question I had regarding the technical integrity of the boat. What was my question to you?
You were asking me what the hell was the captain thinking about purchasing that boat? What was he
And?
thinking? I'll never know the answer to that question.
That was the answer that you gave me.
Of all the people in this book that were no longer alive, some 40 years after the sinking of this vessel, obviously, if there's anyone I could sit down and interview, it would be Captain Michael Stedman, who was lost at sea. This would have been March of 1984. And he was 32 years old. He had 3 beautiful sons, 9, 7, and 3, and a gorgeous widow, Mary Stedman, who's a force of nature and really the main living character of my book. And we'll never know why he chose that particular vessel. Mary, he was sitting on his couch in East Hampton having a beer on a Sunday afternoon. Mary was making a stir fry, and he's flipping through a series of advertisements, boats all over the country. And for whatever reason, he sets his sights on this boat down in Galveston, Texas. And he says to Mary, "This is it. This is the boat I have to have." And she says, "What the hell are you talking about? That boat is in Texas, and we live on Long Island where we're surrounded by water and boats, and it's a little bit out of our budget." And just kept insisting that this was not the boat. He was ready to strike out on his own. He'd been a party boat captain for years and years and was done giving half of his wage to the owner. And Mary didn't deny him that, but there was something very, very laser focused about this particular boat. And again, I don't want to go into any spoiler alerts, but there in speaking with his son, his eldest son, who you'll come to know really at the very end of the book, his version of what was going on with his dad was that unconsciously he knew that his life as it appeared was not, was not as it the life that it appeared was not as it actually was. And that there were a series of sort of fatal miscalculations that he was making in, say, the 6 months prior to his death. This was not a conscious behavior, totally subconscious. In no way am I suggesting that he took these other three beautiful men and got lost in a storm intentionally. But the purchase of this boat, which was never meant to be out in an unforecasted nor'easter, was yeah, a bit of his bad judgment.
The engineering for this particular boat, this is not a giveaway, actually. Mike Stedman, he put a net drum on the wheelhouse of the boat, so we changed the inherent physics of the boat. Bad move. I made a very big mistake when I was 20 years old. I bought a Snipe sailboat. I took a sailing lesson down at Paynes in 1969. Learned how to sail a sunfish. Bought a Snipe 2 months later. Didn't have a car, but I had a boat. And I started chasing. I'm still chasing sails. I still sail a boat. Still single-hand a boat. It's a fine obsession. I made the big mistake one day of telling a guy in a boatyard that I was going to add a bowsprit to my Sprite and fly a bigger headsail. And the guy looked at me, Tom Lee is laughing at me because he knows how insane it is. I was changing the inherent design of a boat that somebody else figured out how to make. The guy said to me, so you, Houlihan, you're going to change the sail plan on the boat by adding a bowsprit. Who the hell do you think you are? Some guy crunched out the math to make this boat. And I went, oh, okay. I never passed a math course in my life. I learned a valuable lesson from this guy. A boat is designed by someone who uses math, calculus, loads, physics, the whole nine. I'm a hammerhead who never passed a math course. I had no business changing the physics of the boat, and I didn't. When I read this book, I was so struck by what Stedman did with this boat and where he took it. That hovered over the whole reading experience for me. And I have several reasons. I have my own reasons of what might have been pushing this man. One of which is competition of that fishery. If you want to talk about the tile fishery in '84, because I got some follow-up stuff about the tile fishery I could add to whatever you're saying. I bet I do. It was a slamming
Let's talk
fishery.
about tile. I'm sure you all came here to just chat about tilefish tonight. We can go there if you'd like.
We'll go there a little bit for the financial reward for that.
Right. Keep in mind that, sort of mid, and correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure.
The mid 70s to the mid 80s was just this ascendant time for long lining for golden tilefish. There was an extreme amount of money to be made. Every single party boat in Montauk, where there were numerous, were retrofitted. Again, using boats that weren't meant to be longliners, were retrofitted to go out in these canyons and do this kind of work as soon as the summer people were gone and until they came back. And so Stedman was certainly not alone in taking a party boat that was built for one purpose and turning it into another. But of course, he then added this extremely top-heavy addition onto this wooden pilot house, which coupled with tens of thousands of pounds of frozen fish, combined with 40-foot seas, was not a wonderful combination.
Change the physics, change the zero moment of the boat, the physics of the boat. I talked to I'm in Galilee most of my life. I know a lot of dragomen. My brother fished offshore. I know former students of mine are still fishing the canyons out at Atlantis Canyon. And I would bet my nickels that my brother included and any other dragoman I know out of Point Judith never would have gotten on the Windblown and gone offshore to the canyons. Without question, that wouldn't have happened. In hindsight, I can say that because there's an edge of the design. There's something that when I read this book, it just seemed off with the design and taking the boat where the crew was taking it in the winter. On the other hand, I understand the drive of the fishermen who are willing to do that for the financial gain. It's a cost-benefit dilemma. It's a risk-reward deal. And fishermen take that. I know people that have lost their lives in Galilee because they did that. So I understand that. And it's powerful. You got a mortgage, you have bills to pay. You also have to prove to your other captains that you are willing to throw down in that fishery. Long lining, prior to long lining, draggers were going out to drag for that species. A friend of mine from Point Judith said directly to me when I asked him about the fishery, because when I worked at the Point Judith Co-op in '75, I would see tilefish on the floor. we were almost trashing the fish in 75. It wasn't a big species. Fluke was the big thing and butterfish. So this friend of mine said, the longliners cheated us out of the fishery. He was adamant. He was not happy with that. So there was a competitive thing going on and the fishery was thriving. People were making a lot of money and that was driving a lot of these young men. And I understand it. I know guys, I had a former student, a student who's now dead. The kid told me one day, he said, Mr. Houlihan, I love your class, but I get a chance to go offshore on the Rowan, this Eastern Rig Dragger out of Point Judith. I'm going to make $5 grand this week. I got to go. And I said, Scotty, go. I won't tell anybody, but you got to write me a composition about hauling back in 15-foot seas. So I made the kid write compositions for me. How can you tell a kid in 1982 not to go offshore and make $5 grand in 5 days? So this is baked into the culture of Montauk as well as Point Judith.
I think the thing too, you know, when I initially sold this book, I had just done a few months of reporting. I would come to interview over 120 people over a course of, you know, 3 years. I do newspaper writing predominantly. I interview someone on the phone a few times, or I meet with them for lunch or coffee, and I write my story and I move on with my life. Well, this was a completely different kind of journalism, and getting to know people, you know, having some really difficult conversations about the most traumatic thing that had ever happened in their lives for the most part. And so I sold this story based on this first kind of layer of this cake, which was these 4 men being lost at sea. But then what I would come to understand about Michael and about Dave and about Scotty and about Michael Vigilant was that they were chasing a dream. They were wrestling with their issues with their fathers and their really dysfunctional families. You know, the alcoholism that would wend through each of their bloodlines, the sense of needing to prove themselves, of not just to the men on the docks, but
Right.
but a real true search for identity. And also then I came to know the women who were left behind, and this issue of grief and loss, and how it was that this insular, you know, thing that occurred in March of 1984, when this was a really small, quaint, charming fishing village, had a very ravaging effect on nearly everyone that was there at the time. And in that way, I think when I began it, I obviously knew that this lived very, very largely in the minds of their friends and their families. But, you know, I would interview the local lighthouse keeper who would tell me, you know, she was working at the bank and recalled to me the exact date it had gone down some 40 years later. And, you know, people on Block Island might not have even really heard about it. They might have read a little snippet in the
Right,
Times
right.
and kind of moved on. So it
We
became,
heard about boats that went down in Point Judith primarily. And I've heard of catastrophes happening at Old Harbor on small draggers from Stonington. A man fell overboard once trying to navigate in during a storm, left the wife and 3 kids behind. I heard the whole thing on my Marine sideband radio at home. So we would hear that kind of thing. And that tragedy and where they think the boat ended up, it probably was for that area, for that locale, it was big news. But this part of the, you know, Block Island and Point Judith and the Cape, other tragedies happened, you know. What I find interesting about this is Amanda is alluding to the guys, the disparity of their experiences. A couple of them were from well-heeled families. A couple of them were from working class families of Montauk. And you know, what she was just talking about, they were looking for something, maybe finding their way in the world, and the boat, that platform, was the great equalizer. Can you throw down to go out there and work this fishery, make this money, and be in this? And all of these guys were totally committed to doing that. And again, as I was reading the book, I saw a lot of the cultural and the economic, socioeconomic disparity on Long Island. And I love the way you wrote about the Long Island Railroad, the Long Island Expressway. Talk about that a little bit, if you will, just how that kind of created a dichotomy, financial dichotomy, if you will, cultural dichotomy on on Long Island.
Certainly. So, part of me also wanted to learn. I live year round now in Sag Harbor, though I grew up in Southern California. So I am a very, very recent arrival. I'm a total outsider to the place that I live, to the people that I'm writing about. And that has been an interesting dynamic in terms of the fallout for sure. We could talk about that later. But, I think that, I did know initially, and part of what fascinates me about where I live, any real seasonal community, is this huge disparity, right, between the summer people and the people who take care of them. And so Dave Connick, who was the really true blue-blooded son, Maidstone Club member. His father had gone to Yale. His grandfather had gone to Yale. His father was an enormously successful litigator on Wall Street. The idea that a Maidstone Club kid in the 80s would end up, graduating from high school and moving out to Montauk the next day and become a commercial fisherman was pretty much not a thing, as it is now. Absolutely doesn't exist, totally non-existent. And yes, part of that railroad, part of the, Montauk was never anything unless you were able to get there, right? That 100 years ago, it was successful by a horse and carriage. And it was certainly always a summer destination up to a certain point, but it wasn't really until that railroad allowed, the fishermen special and the day tripping fishermen to go out to that port and really access it. And, otherwise it certainly wouldn't have become the fishery that it is today.
Yeah, and Amanda does a great job fleshing that out. I found that to be very, very interesting. I've never been to Montauk. Cindy and I will be going to visit Sag Harbor in the fall because I want to learn more about the place. However, back to these four guys being on the platform, that was going to be the proving ground for them to make money, to be men, to be capitalized, to have money, to have an identity that had to be very strong. Again, I defer to Point Judith, where I grew up, and former students of mine that went, and they made a hell of a lot of more money than Mr. Houlihan, the English teacher, made when they were 19. And they made 50 grand a year and put 40 of it up their nose. I saw a lot of stuff with my former students. It's a ravaging job. It can really do a tap dance on people. The drive, however, the economic competitive nature of a fisherman, to me, I find that fascinating how it's baked into their DNA. I know several in Point Judith as we speak right now. And there's a one-upmanship thing going on. There's also pushing the edge of the envelope with weather and technology. And I want Amanda to allude to that as well regarding NOAA's forecasting, the time of year that the guys went off to the canyon.
Yeah, this is pretty much the worst time of year to be doing that kind of work. It still is the world's, America's certainly most dangerous profession, commercial fishing, in terms of the risk of fatality. Obviously, back in the 80s, weather was given twice a day on the radio, and if you weren't listening, you didn't hear it. Certainly, we weren't forecasting 7 to 10 days out. That kind of technology just simply didn't exist. There is still the question, though. So everyone in the fleet of Montauk made it back somehow. Some docked in Stonington. The inlet in Montauk was actually flooded with so much water that it was impassable, which is a phenomenon that has not occurred since '84. There were, a boat was capsized and there was a rescue, and there were all sorts of near misses. One of the captains that I interviewed, who recently passed away, came in and kissed the ground because he had never felt so thankful to be alive as he did that morning of March 29th. But for whatever darn reason, and we'll never know the answer to this, because his last call on the radio was to tell his wife that he loved her, Michael Stedman decided to stay out longer than anyone else in the fleet. And was it because he was catching so darn much fish, or was it because they had mechanical difficulties? I have absolutely no idea. And so I think a lot of people, when they pick up this book or they see the cover, they've read The Perfect Storm, or they're a fan of Nathaniel Philbrick's work and they want to read that book again. Well, this is not that book for you. Maybe because I'm a woman, maybe because actually this book, although the main tragedy occurs at sea, this book has nothing to do with a tragedy at sea in many ways. It's a book about families. It's a book about what brought these foursome onto this boat to begin with. It's about the women left behind. It's about what grief and trauma does to the human psyche, the way it wends through other generations. So that's not the perfect storm.
Right,
Um,
right, without question. So, it's a
yeah.
totally different book. And I beg to differ regarding rereading. I could reread the book again, I'm sure I will. When I learn more about Montauk in that area, that locale, I'm going to want to learn more. The fishery in Montauk fosters a sense of competition as it does in Galilee. These guys were rising up to that. Weather technology at that time. I wrote a column a couple of weeks ago for this paper on Block Island for the Times, and I talked about 1974 when I worked on the Manitou, when Matty Rooney hired me as a deck ape. Matty was the captain. The way we used to get weather intel in 74 is we would call Jimmy Mott in Old Harbor and say, hey, Jimmy, the wind's blowing south-southeast, say it's blowing 35 knots. Hey, Jimmy, how big are the seas in front of Ballards? Are they coming over the wall? Well, yeah, they're coming over the wall. What's the tide doing? It's coming in. What are the gusts like out there, Jim? 35, I think. Okay, we'll get back to you. Click, we'd load the boat. That's how we got our weather intel. Or Matty Rooney would go to the top of the wheelhouse of the Manitou, look for a tanker transiting Block Island Sound, ask that captain what it was like at 1BI. And we had to make a decision to take that ferry, the Manitou, and if you've ever done a 55-degree roll on that boat, it's pretty goddamn scary. It drove me right out of the Merchant Marine. So when we're talking about this book, about these guys taking a boat that was sketchy in design, eyeball engineered to add things and take away things. What my takeaway from is this drive that is baked into a young person in any career to drive, to strive to succeed and take risks. I don't think there's anyone in this room that never took a risk. I know I've taken a few. So that was one of the things that hovered over the entire book. And it was very evocative and interesting about the culture of Montauk and how it changed because of the economic disparity, as it still is now, correct? It's probably still regarding a working class environment in Montauk. What's going on in Montauk as far as that demographic?
I mean, we have huge affordable housing issues. It's
Okay.
pretty much non-existent. The traffic is just, as there's the lack of housing, the traffic in the mornings, they call it the trade parade where everyone rolls into town, from 6 to 9 in the morning to be housekeepers and gardeners and nannies and working, waiters and waitresses and what have you. And butlers and whoever else, I don't know who exactly all these people employ. And then they make an exodus in the kind of late afternoon, early evening. Montauk has completely changed. It's not a charming fishing village. I actually refuse. My husband and I refuse to drive there after dark mostly. There's a very treacherous stretch of road, and there's a ton of drinking and driving. And I mean, it's really fun too. There's a lot of young people, and it's really big with a kind of hipster New York crowd flying in on their helicopters and partying for the weekend. It sounds like I should work with the Chamber of Commerce, right? But yeah, it's and I think part of me wrote this also because I wish I had been there in the 70s and 80s, right? I was 4 years old when this tragedy occurred. So obviously I was not living in Montauk at the time. But I certainly would have loved to have experienced the East End in its heyday, as you were, I think, were describing what Block Island was like all those years ago.
Yeah, we were reminiscing about what this place was like back in the late 60s, 1970, when I worked for John Ronosky, twisting wrenches with John Sr. when the Manitou came on the run, how that changed the real estate out here because you could put a lumber truck on the boat. And I've been with the ferry company so long, I've seen the company grow and the demographics change because of that, subsequent to that. So I'm sure the same thing is happening on Montauk. What remains is a fishing port. where people are going to go to sea. And they're going to go push the edge of the envelope and they're going to throw down. My brother did it. My brother came back from the canyons on trips sometimes. He'd be 10 pounds lighter than when he left. He would throw down, hauling down at 40 fathom. They'd haul for 9, 10, 12 hours, 800 pots of lobster. He'd come home and collapse on my floor. I understood my brother. He wanted to show big brother Joey, I can kick your ass, big brother, and I'm tougher than you. And you can go teach school. I'm going to go catch lobsters. That was in my brother and I, we still can duke it out if we have to. So I understand that. And that hovers all over this book. It really does. And it leads me to the inner psychology of Mike Stedman primarily. So I read it from that. That was one of the takeaways from me. The grief aspect of it is covered prodigiously by Amanda. She leaves no stone unturned with that. What I found really interesting about Amanda as a writer, after Susan gave me the book, that fortuitous day I got the book and I burned right through it, Susan, thank you, dear, is here's this kid from LA. She's from Santa Monica, and she's going to come to, Long Island and write about offshore fishermen at Atlantis Canyon and Betches Canyon. And I'm thinking, wow, I got to meet this woman. This is amazing. Because it's a heavily researched book. How many people did you interview? 120?
Just about, yeah.
So it's one thing to interview these people, then it's another to assimilate, to absorb and assimilate all of that information and make a readable narrative out of it that's very cohesive. And I think Amanda did that handsomely. I think it was extremely well written. I loved it.
I have to say the commercial fishermen were incredibly forthcoming.
Nice.
I would ask them all sorts of really inane technical questions. I knew absolutely nothing about commercial fishing. Another through line through this book is surfing, which I know that is a
Right.
passion that you share.
Sure. Yeah.
And that was a huge thing that brought Michael Stedman out to Montauk in the 70s, was just living, part of the counterculture, living a totally different life than his father had lived. Another reader had sent me a lovely note, essentially suggesting that the book actually would have been really tragic had they not followed their dreams and their hearts, and had Michael and Dave, wound up as stockbrokers or
Right.
corporate attorneys and, died in a midtown office building. That they were out doing the thing that made them feel the most alive in the world. And there's great courage to be found in that.
And it drove them. Another testament to this is a former student of mine was down at my ferry shack in the standby lot. Amanda flipped me a couple of copies of the book. I gave a couple of copies to some friends on the island here. And one of my students came by, a kid who still fishes the canyons. He goes out to Betches Canyon on a dragger. He raised up his kids. He's got 3 kids. And I said, this kid does some writing. I love this kid. He's like a son. Another one of my students who I'm very fond of. Tough dude. Gentle but tough. And I gave him the book, your book. And he took it home and he called me about 2 nights later and he said, Joey, I believe this woman. I love this book. I fish Atlantis Canyon. I get it. That to me is the gold star, because this guy's a no bullshit guy. Russell is out there probably right now feeding his family in the fishery. And I love that when a writer does something, gets that kind of street cred from the real deal. This guy's the real deal. He comes in on a dragger in Galilee and flips me tuna steaks for the past 10 years. And he's telling me that she from Santa Monica, California, coming to the East Coast. I find that's a big attaboy, attagirl.
Well, that's really kind, because there's a whole subset of folks in East Hampton and Montauk that I've completely pissed off based on my
Welcome to our
rendering of
world.
this account.
Yeah.
I think, I'm in the book not as an exercise in narcissism, but just to explain to folks who are not from where I'm writing about what this huge dichotomy is between the insiders and the outsiders. And it's such a fascinating place to me. I could be interviewing Joey here and he'd tell me he was born at Southampton Hospital. And he'd say, but I'm not really from here, because my ancestors don't go back 300 years. And that's just so curious to me, coming from California, where you can sort of just reinvent yourself overnight. Anyway,
I
we also want to open it up for questions. We've almost been talking for.
Yeah, I want to say
Good
one
chunk of
last
time.
thing
Yeah.
to give Amanda one last kudo for her effort. I think that being a Californian, coming here, being degreed at Columbia, being a full-on journalist, I have total respect for this woman as a writer. I have her in the ballpark of Nat Philbrick, Sebastian Younger, David McCullough. Researched heavy narrative. She's in that. I'm not using those names lightly. I'm familiar with these guys. I know a couple of them. So I give her kudos for that. Finally, I think that Amanda was the one that was supposed to write this book. She brought an objective position, warts and all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It showed us, it evoked something in me. I learned something. Moreover, I saw the tenacity and the guts it took for the writer to do her job as a journalist and throw down that effort. And for that, I applaud you, my friend, and I'm going to clap for her.
Thank you, Joey. Appreciate it.
Questions?
Yes, please. Oh, so that's an interesting question. So the boat originated in Captree, and it was a party boat, and it was added on to in length by its original owner. It was built first in 65. And then it went down to Galveston, where it was essentially just a boat that would ferry workers from different oil rigs back to shore. And it just was sort of doing that kind of passenger ferrying. So certainly not long lining, not going way off into the canyons, that type of work. Yes, of course. Hi. But what? No, just kidding. So that's a great question. So the work that I do does not involve the signing of a waiver. I'm a journalist. I conduct an interview on the record, and certain things are obviously off the record and will never leave my confidence. It's a funny thing when you invite a journalist to tell the story of your life and into some of the darkest corners that you've experienced. And this is actually the PG version of the story. I could have included a whole bunch more details that I decided to leave out. What I did include actually weighed very, very heavily on my conscience, and it underwent several different iterations and drafts in terms of what would go in, what would stay out. Ultimately, I'm a truth teller, right? So I tell the real version of what happened. And yeah, so I told the truth. And all of our lives, our interior lives, are a whole lot more complicated than I think the version that we might present to the world is. And one of the folks in the story, Chris, that you meet at the end, was very adamant that he had been living under this cloud of unreality, that everyone in the town of East Hampton knew what had happened. This was not a state secret. I was told by one of the Stedman boys, one of their girlfriends, that if I didn't include the secret in the story, that actually relates to the very theme of my book, which is about paternity and a search for identity and meaning and fatherhood and fathers and sons. It's a huge thread undergirding every sentence in this book, that it would make it seem as though I didn't know what the heck I was talking about. That everyone who grew up in the 80s in Montauk in East Hampton knew this secret, and that I needed to tell it. So obviously not everyone agrees with that choice. And that's part of the fun work that I get to do, is dealing with that, the aftermath of that. Yeah. Yes. So thank God for the women in the story. I didn't really know about them. I knew Mary, of course. She was my entry into the story. But the men were great. No offense, Joey. women are always better. And
Wisdom of Athena,
and I have to
goddess
say,
of wisdom and war.
you know, that the commercial fishermen were incredibly great at telling me that, you know, explaining how the long line worked. But when I would ask them about, you know, well, what was Dave Connick really like? Or tell me about Michael Vigilant. Well, it wasn't until I got to sit down with Alice Connick and spend the day with her, Dave's mother, who's since passed away, or Mary. I mean, these were the people who took these men that had kind of been sketches and silhouettes and really brought them to life. You know, these were the women that were left behind. And I think so often we hear about these stories and it is all about the men. And for me, the story is as much about the people who are left behind as it is about the men that were lost at sea. Yes. Thank you so much for being here.
Great for us to hear that
Oh, sorry about that.
No, that's
Didn't
all
even
right.
think of that.
I was supposed
You can do that, kid. You can
Like
sing
to
a song.
sing just a little bit.
A short haul hat and
Low,
shanty.
yeah.
Well, it's not long. Go ahead.
So I'm a merchant seaman and I went to sea for about 34 years. And I've always, and most of my career was just men. Now there's more women in the fleet, but it's always occurred to me that all we had to do was take a ship from point A back home. The women back home had to do everything else that involves raising a family or running a family or a household. So I do appreciate that and your thinking on that matter.
Good
So-
observation.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. You know,
Absolutely true.
Mary was a widow at 29, but in many ways she was a widow long before that, right? Because once her husband would go off to sea every week, Monday through Saturday, she was raising her boys all on her own. I think often of the whaling village that I get to live in, right? And centuries prior, men would go off to sea for years at a time. Children would be born, children would die, the household had to be maintained. I mean, I just find that truly, truly extraordinary in terms of that sacrifice. Obviously, these men are off, such as yourself, doing this very difficult, important, exhausting, strenuous work. And I think that burden is certainly equally shared by the women at home. Obviously, now that gender dynamic is a little bit shifted, but predominantly in Montauk, they're nearly all that are men that are doing this work. Did that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
When I took Amanda over to the memorial at Camp Cronin in Point Judith, we took pictures of the memorial. And to speak to what Keith just said, all of those men that are on that, it's a patriarchal society, the fishery is, and all of those men left families behind, children, wives, mothers. I mean, it's such a wrenching thing to see that many people on this little peninsula of Point Judith. And I was compelled to bring her right there. That's all I really wanted to do, is get you right over there to see as a testament to your work. And it's the same thing on Montauk and Stonington and Cape Cod and, you know, the vineyard, the whaling cultures of Nantucket, of course. We could say the same thing. And it was so visceral to read her book there, because that was all baked into it. The lost families. I know the wives. I know the kids. I live in that. I live in Galilee, you know, and it was a riveting piece of literature. It was a riveting book to read. Very wrenching. Question more.
Give me some hard questions here. I just
What's
got one.
some
I've just
hardballs?
had one so far.
Mine is really an easy one. And the question is, would this easily be made into a movie? And if so, why? Or if not, why?
So that's a good question. I had a whole bunch of film interests last summer and TV interest, and one one of the many men that took me out to lunch or dinner or whatever, or had a Zoom call or whatever the heck it was, would explain to me that in the second season, everyone would come back as zombies, which after which I asked for the check that we were done having our meeting. It's very exciting. So it is maybe going to be made into something. It's still, a shot in the dark. But Hulu actually ordered a pilot to be written. And this extraordinarily talented playwright came out, and he's a showrunner as well. He's worked in TV for about the last 30 years. He's in his late 50s. Came out to Montauk and East Hampton for about a week, early in about mid-June. And it was really amazing because I got to see this area through the lens of someone that's never set foot there before. He's from the Midwest. He used to be a minister. Then he went out to LA and made 7 times the amount of money he had been making and stayed there writing TV. And what's so interesting about it is that he gets to add on, everything in my book is true. He gets to add on layers of fiction onto his version, right? So it'll be based on these sketches of these people, but then obviously I don't know what they were talking about at their breakfast table, and neither does he. And he sort of sees it as this, obviously an ongoing sort of series. So we'll see. So he and I are now working on writing an outline. And then he'll write a pilot, and then Hulu will decide based on that pilot if they would like to order a series. So again, this is a real shot in the dark. But I'm involved as an executive producer, and maybe I'll write an episode if it were to ever to come to that. So it's very, very exciting. Okay. A gold.
Question was, what's a tilefish?
These gentlemen were hunting for something called a golden tilefish, which is a bottom dwelling species that lives way out in the canyons, and they burrow into these little holes that are very interesting, these little kind of grottos, some of which now scientists have found that are these abandoned little caves or what have you. There's another term that I learned while I was researching the book, which I find totally fascinating, which is called shifting baseline syndrome, which is essentially a generational term where, we come to understand the size of a shrimp or a sea bass or whatever the heck it is based on, what we see of it, right? So a shrimp is this size and what have you. So these guys in the 70s to 80s were catching golden tilefish that were between 30 to 50 pounds a piece. And now there are 2 fleets left in Montauk that still longline for tilefish. They go out 7 days on, 7 days off. They're still longlining for those goddamn tilefish. The fishery is alive. They're the only ones that do it. But now the golden tilefish are 3 to 7 pounds. And these guys are in their 20s, and they have no idea what a golden tilefish would look like that was 40 or 50 pounds because they don't exist anymore, or at least they're not catching them anymore. But they're catching a lot of them, and a lot of it gets exported overseas. So yeah, there is also a whole chapter about golden tilefish in my book, should you choose to read it.
Very interesting.
I could have made it 3 times as long because I really geeked out on golden tilefish, as you can tell.
I'm glad you geeked out. I learned.
Really went for it on the golden tilefish. Yeah.
Understand that fish.
Good thing I had an editor who's like, we need to cut that in half. Thank you so much, John. Thank you all. Thank you, Joey. Very appreciative for you all making time to be at a book talk on a steamy, beautiful July evening. So thank you.
And thank you all for coming. There are some copies of the book back there, and maybe we can get Amanda to actually autograph a few for you. If you haven't read it and you're not excited about it now, you haven't been listening. So anyway, thanks for coming.
Thank you all for coming. It's great to see people I normally see in Point Judith. This is a hallmark experience. Jim and Pam Henthorne, I feel, and Chris Blanchard, all my peeps, all the people that I would see 13 miles north of here. I feel Cindy Baudet, I feel like a whole, the Lewis brothers, I feel reborn. For the